Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Kiana Irvin. I'm an assistant professor of history and a faculty affiliate in the Department of Black Studies here at MU. You should have received an event survey earlier this evening. We welcome your thoughts on how to improve this series for our community through your feedback. Once you have completed it, please turn it in to the information table. My colleague and co-director Gary Kramer and I thank you for coming. We wish to extend our deepest thanks and appreciation to Interim President Michael Middleton, Interim Chancellor Dr. Hank Foley, Chuck Hinson, Interim Vice Chancellor for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity at MU, Nora Azizan Gardner, Chief Diversity Officer at MU, Mary Ellen Lohman, Strategic Communications Manager at the State Historical Society of Missouri, and Rebecca Calvin, Media and Strategic Communications Manager for the Chancellor's Diversity Initiative. We would also like to thank our colleagues, students, and friends who helped to spread the word about this series. A collaboration of the State Historical Society of Missouri's Center for Missouri Studies and the University of Missouri's Division of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity, the lecture series will explore the history of Black Americans in Missouri from the earliest period of statehood to the present. Over the next year and a half, we will host more than a dozen scholars who will give presentations on everything from slavery to political activism, the meaning of race to urban decline, and the rise of jazz culture to the history of Black institutions. Dr. Walter Johnson, Winthrop Professor of History and Director of the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University, will deliver next month's lecture on April 21st at the Missouri Theater. He will speak on the subject, No Rights Which the White Man Was Bound to Respect, Racial Capitalism and Empire in the Age of Dred Scott. Author of Soul by Soul, Life Inside the Antebellum Slave Market, and River of Dark Dreams, Slavery and Imperialism in the Mississippi Valley, Johnson will use Dred Scott's personal struggle for freedom through the Missouri court system and the controversial outcome of his U.S. Supreme Court case as a lens to illuminate the central role of St. Louis in the history of the United States. Now to tonight's talk. Writer, commentator, researcher, and historian, Dr. Martha S. Jones, the Arthur F. Thurnau Professor at the University of Michigan, is a member of the law school's affiliated LSA faculty, Professor of History and Afro-American and African Studies, and Associate Chair of the Department of Afro-American and African Studies. She is co-director of the Michigan Law Program in Race, Law, and History. She holds a PhD in history from Columbia University and a JD from the CUNY School of Law. Prior to joining the Michigan faculty, she was public interest litigator for the HIV Law Project and MFY Legal Services, where her work focused on the rights of people with disabilities. In 1994, she was a Charles H. Revson Fellow on the future of the City of New York at Columbia University in recognition of her lawyering work. Her scholarly interests include the histories of race, citizenship, and slavery. Professor Jones is the author of numerous articles and essays and the critically acclaimed All Bound Up Together, The Woman Question in African American Public Culture, 1830 to 1900. She is also the co-editor of Toward an Intellectual History of Black Women. Her current project is the book Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America. Professor Jones describes this work as, quote, a new history of the 14th Amendment, one that begins in a local courthouse, asking how Black Americans constructed their legal rights through everyday proceedings. It is a historian's tribute to the clients I represented in New York City's poor people's trial courts. Professor Jones has received broad support and recognition for her work. At times, that recognition has come in the form of research grants and writing fellowships. In 2013 to 2014, her work was supported by the American Council of Learned Societies and the National Humanities Center, where she was the William C. and Ida Friday Fellow. She also has held fellowships from the Columbia University Center for the Critical Analysis of Social Difference, University of Pennsylvania Law School, National Constitution Center, Organization of American Historians, Library Company of Philadelphia, and Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. In 2010, Professor Jones was elected as Distinguished Lecturer with the Organization of American Historians. In 2015, she was elected to the Michigan Society of Fellows as a Senior Fellow, and in 2016, she was appointed a Presidential Bicentennial Professor to help mark the 200th anniversary of the University of Michigan. We are fortunate to have such a distinguished scholar in our midst. I'm thrilled. I hope you are too. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Martha S. Jones.
Good evening. Thank you for the introduction, and I'm really very honored to be here this evening. I'm honored to take part in this lecture series on the African American experience in Missouri. I want to extend special thanks to the State Historical Society of Missouri and the University of Missouri's Division of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity. And a special thanks to Gary Kremer, whose generosity, whose scholarship, and whose spirit has really been very important to the work I'm going to speak with you about today. I spent the early afternoon today in Fulton, Missouri, the place where Celia lived and died, speaking to the faculty and students and staff at William Woods University. It was my second visit to Fulton, and it's difficult as someone who has taught and researched Celia's case for many years. It's really difficult not to experience a visit to Fulton as a pilgrimage of sorts. And I'm not alone, I don't think, among historians in working by way of a sort of belief that we learn something new, something extra when we walk the streets or the paths that our subjects once walked. With Gary Kremer and my collaborators on the Celia Project, I visited the site of the farm where Celia was for so many years, she endured what is nearly unspeakable. I paced the 60 steps that were said to separate her cabin from her owner's farmhouse. I've stood in front of the spot where the Callaway County Courthouse stood, where Celia was tried, convicted, and later hanged. And I suppose you'd say that in those sorts of moments, I'm listening. No, it's not that I expect to hear Celia's voice, though you may meet historians who will tell you that people speak to them from the beyond. I don't expect to hear Celia's voice exactly. Celia, if she's there somewhere, I hope she's in a place where she need not return to us to recount the details of her short and troubled life. Instead, I'm looking for clues. I'm listening for ways to tell you her story, how to tell it in a way that's both faithful to the past and relevant for the present. So say her name. I have said Celia's name countless times, of that I'm quite certain. Still, this 21st century hashtag demands more. It demands that I not merely say her name, Celia. It demands that I make that invocation matter. Say her name draws attention to how Black women and girls are also subject to police violence. It is an intervention in the movement that we call Black Lives Matter, one that reminds us as citizens, as activists, as commentators, as scholars, that violence against women, including sexual violence, demands our attention and our action. The hashtag includes a critique against public policy that is framed around concerns for young Black men, but not their female counterparts. Say her name framed rethinking of President Obama's My Brother's Keeper initiative and helped galvanize those who brought forth from the White House Council on Women and Girls a 5-year initiative to advance equity for women and girls of color. Say her name, it turns out, is a powerful assertion and an effective rallying cry. It is also a demand for activism and innovative public policy. For a historian, one who constructs stories and explanations of the past, say her name is a challenge. It is a challenge that demands that we regard our work as more than antiquarian retellings of that foreign place that we call the past. Say her name demands that we write and make use of history to transform our present. What I'll ask you today is, what are the links between Celia's past and our present? One answer, I think, lies in an explanation of Black women's history and relationships to state violence. Our 21st century questions are ones about how the state disciplines, punishes, controls Black women through agents of violence. In this sense, Celia's case reminds us that this state violence is an old problem, one with origins in the antebellum United States and the institution of slavery. At the same time, another answer lies in how we remember Celia today, or more precisely, the uses to which we put Celia's case in the present. So I'll end today by sharing ideas that come out of the Celia Project about how we might remember this young enslaved woman and what that memory does for us in the present. So Celia's case will take us back to the mid-1850s, to Fulton, Missouri, and it will permit us to see the extended history of state violence against Black women in the United States. The elements of Celia's case sound familiar, perhaps eerily so. They include racism, the state, sexual assault, and a court system unprepared and perhaps unable to manufacture justice for a woman like Celia. Say her name, we'll discover, is not simply a 21st century slogan. It is an admonition for historians such as myself to discover, to recover, and reinterpret the past with Black women's names, their experiences, and their voices at the center. As familiar as this framing may be to us, Celia's story is also clearly one about the past, our past in the United States. Indeed, no one facet is more important for our understanding than the fact that Celia was held as a slave. She was a person with a price. That's a phrase from Walter Johnson, who you'll hear from next month. Over her short lifetime, Celia was bought and sold. She labored without compensation and without consent. She did not determine the fates of her children and was, as we'll see, subject to sexual violence, violence that would be approved of, condoned, and allowed by the state of Missouri. State violence may sound to some ears as a misplaced characterization of a system that we oftentimes think of as a private one, private ownership, governed by private law. But Celia was held pursuant to a contract of sale, and most of her short life was lived outside the direct supervision of the state and its agents. She might never have met a sheriff, a jail keeper, or a judge until after the fateful events that led to her execution in 1855. Still, we'll discover how law had always framed the day-to-day circumstances of Celia's life, how her relations with her owner were defined and came to be redefined by law's capacity to say who was a woman and who was not, to determine who was entitled to exercise self-defense and who was not, to record the life stories of women when they themselves could not. Let's begin, for those of you less familiar, with a recounting of Celia's life. There's very little to say about her young life. We don't meet her in a formal historical sense until Celia is 14 years old. She's a young enslaved woman in Adrian County in central Missouri. She's purchased by a small farmer in the county of Callaway and the town of Fulton. He travels to Adrian, purchases Celia, and from the very first moment of this encounter, our understandings are powerfully framed. Her owner very soon sexually assaulted Celia. Some will say on the very journey back to Fulton, or shortly thereafter when they arrived at the farm. What was this place to which Celia had come? Her owner was a recent widower. In his household were his children, now adults, and a grandson. He was the owner of a small farm, not a plantation setting. This is not a large-scale enterprise. At most, he owned 5 enslaved people in his lifetime, including Celia. A small slaveholder, typical of central Missouri, he made his way as a subsistence farmer, raising foodstuffs to feed his family and livestock for the market. Some whispered that he also produced whiskey. But Celia arrived not to do agricultural work, not to do farm labor. As she was brought to the farm, the purpose was perhaps she would do domestic work within the household, but she would also, over the course of the next 5 years, become the regular and frequent target of sexual assault. Her owner built Celia a small cabin 60 paces from his home, far away but not too far away to keep him at a distance. Celia would come to live there and bear 2 children, likely his, children we come to know later as Vine and Jane. And Celia, by 1855, was pregnant again for a 3rd time. She told people that she was sick. I'm never sure whether in this moment sick is a metaphor for pregnancy. It would be a way that women would speak of pregnancy in polite terms. Or perhaps she was in fact ill and having a difficult pregnancy. What is clear is that Celia did not want to be visited by her owner, that she intended finally to resist the ongoing sexual assaults to which she was subjected. The first things she appeared to do was to speak to her owner's adult daughters. She asked them to intervene with their father. She asked them to help her, encourage him to desist. To no avail. Celia then had her own confrontation, and here we arrive at the core of our story. Celia advised her owner when he came to her cabin that she would not have sexual relations with him. She warned him not to seek her out, not to visit her. Still, on a June night in 1855, he made his way those 60 paces and presented himself in Celia's cabin. He entered, spoke to her, and then stepped forward as if he intended to assault her. Celia defended herself. She picked up a stick, some say it was a club, and she struck him once and then again, perhaps many times, before he fell to the floor, dead. What do you do if you're Celia? What do you do? Part of what we know is when she retells the story to investigators is that Celia was initially shocked and surprised. She had not anticipated this result. She had intended to fend off her assailant, but she had not meant to kill him. Her aim was to protect herself, to resist sexual assault. But as she realized she had killed him, the question was, how should she deal with that fact? We know she attempted to conceal the evidence. We know that she took the body, she moved it into the hearth, into the fire of her cabin, and over the remainder of the evening, she stoked that fire 6 hours until the body was largely destroyed, leaving ashes and bone fragments. By morning, little evidence was left. Celia was confident enough that she had concealed her act, that as morning broke, she resumed the regular routines of the household. She went on to make breakfast for the family. When the children awoke, they noticed that their father was missing, and a search began. First, it was the children themselves who scoured the property looking for him. They wondered if he hadn't wandered off and been injured. But subsequently, neighbors came to begin a much more aggressive search that included, again, scouring the property, but also questioning the people on the farm, including Celia, another enslaved man, George, who we'll talk more about later, and the family itself. One grandson explained that he had helped Celia spread the ashes from her fireplace along a side path leading to the barn. George, this enslaved man, related that perhaps they wanted to search, at least in the area of Celia's cabin. Celia herself was questioned, and she progressively told a story. Initially, she denied knowing anything, but slowly, under pressure, she began to reveal what had happened the night before. We can understand her reluctance, I think, to admit what had transpired. But as investigators began to not only question her, but to threaten that she might be separated from her children if she did not cooperate, Celia did indeed confess. She explained that she had struck Newsom, that she had burned his body and spread the ashes. The story now moves into a legal frame, and much of the evidence, much of what we know about Celia comes from the court record in this case. An inquest was held, a local grand jury heard testimony from many of the witnesses. Celia was indicted, formally charged with murder. There was a trial, and many of the same parties who were first gathered together, if you will, on the farm the morning after the killing were there again, gathered together in the courthouse to tell their stories. Celia herself did not testify. Missouri law prohibited, generally, all defendants from testifying in their own behalf in this period. Defendants were perceived to be too self-interested to give objective or reliable testimony. But others recounted Celia's version of the long events that led to the killing. She related her purchase, her initial assault, the bearing of 2 children, the continued assaults. One thing emerges very clearly during the trial and from this record. No one ever denied Celia's part of the story. No one, not even her owner's children, contradicted the story that Celia told. No one. There was never a question that he had demanded sex from Celia, that she had survived years of abuse, and that she was pregnant once again, and then tried to resist. This story, Celia's own story, was adopted by local farmer witnesses, by the family, and by the court itself. On this point, everyone agreed. Celia was found guilty by a local jury. We'll come back a bit to the jury deliberations also. And she was sentenced to death by hanging. And then there's a curious moment, or at least curious still for me, one that I think we know too little about still. Celia avoided execution on her initial hanging date because she was secreted out of the jail and taken to a hiding place. Who was responsible for aiding her? We can't exactly say. It's one of the mysteries of this case. But we do know that eventually she returned to the jail, to the custody of the state. A new execution date was set. The state's Court of Appeals refused to stay or delay the execution until the case was formally reviewed. There was no merit, the High Court said, in Celia's attempt at an appeal. And with no legal barrier remaining to delaying her execution, on December 21st, 1855, Celia was hanged in Fulton. What I want to do with the rest of my time today is revisit Celia's case with Say Her Name in mind. I want to come back to her case, to the history of state violence, the history of how slavery and law operated hand in glove in the life of Celia, the history of how layers of violence, what we might term law's narrative violence, that is the violence that results from the stories, the characterizations, the interpretations of law, how these all tell us something important about the positions and the experiences of enslaved women. This is a shot of the site where the farm once stood in Fulton. This is now here what you'll find are trees and clearings, some cornerstones, foundation stones, but really just a shadow of the farm of 1855. The court record, while it includes a confession by Celia, and here, I think if I have a pointer. Here is a page from Celia's, what's often termed Celia's Confession. You can see her X here at the bottom of the page. The court record offers us some window into Celia's story. but it is a fragmentary one, a partial one that is really framed very powerfully by the kinds of questions that investigators, that lawyers, that jurors and judges ask. It is not a window into the interiority, I think, of Celia herself. And so for the historian looking to retell Celia's story, we look beyond the text of this record to other sources, attempting to piece together what life in that household might have been like for Celia as a young woman. And on the left, you'll see the title page from what is today a frequently read text authored by Harriet Jacobs in 1860 and 61, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Jacobs, like Celia, was enslaved as a young woman, in her case in North Carolina. She too was preyed upon by the head of the household in which she lived and worked. Jacobs tells us in her narrative, published narrative, which, by the way, she publishes under a pseudonym for fear of recrimination. But she tells us in this narrative what it's like to live daily with the threat, the specter, the fear of sexual assault for a young enslaved woman working in a household. So we learn a great deal, I think, from Jacobs about how to understand the terror, if you will, that Celia lived with day in, day out. It helps us understand that desperate act in 1855. Jacobs also, like Celia, is determined to find a way out. And she takes, however, a very different route, and she tells us in her narrative how she escapes from her household, leaving behind her children, a mother like Celia leaving behind her children, but she escapes the household, and Jacobs' story is quite remarkable because she spends 7 years hiding in an attic nearby, an attic in a home owned by her grandmother, waiting for the opportunity to flee North Carolina and arrive in free territory. 7 years in what was a crawl space. And so while the circumstances of these two women were dramatically different in some regards, Jacobs, the enslaved woman who had learned to read and write and ultimately will publish her memories in a book that is still widely read today, Celia, unable to read and write, relying upon the words, the promises, the reassurance of others as she marks the X on her confession. Even as these two women lead in many ways very different lives, their companion stories, I think, helps us appreciate that part of the work inspired by Say Her Name is find her voice, right? Find those clues, those openings, those signs that help us appreciate what a court record will not tell us, which is how it is that a young woman subject to sexual violence over many years finally makes the desperate decision to pick up a club and to strike out in her own self-defense. I wouldn't want to get us too far away from the law, however, and so I want to talk a little bit about the context for this case and what goes on within the courtroom itself. Here, again, Celia's story in all its complexity, in all its elaborateness, narrowed down to categories that are bequeathed, in a sense, to her and to the others from the state legislature in Missouri. This is the statute that in Celia's time was in effect, this prohibition, the crime of defilement, today what we would term rape or sexual assault. And I want you to notice the language here. Every person who shall take any woman unlawfully against her will, by force, menace, or duress, compel her to marry him or to marry any other person, or to be defiled upon conviction thereof, shall be punished by imprisonment in the penitentiary of not less than 3, nor exceeding 5 years. So here, defilement is a felony in the state of Missouri, and at least as defined in the plain language of this statute, any woman, right? Any person who shall take any woman can be charged and prosecuted under this statute. What does the court do with this statute when presented with it in Celia's case is an important turning point in her fate. And it happens at, I think, a moment that oftentimes we might overlook or regard as quite ordinary in legal culture. It happens at the moment at which this trial court in Fulton develops the instructions it will provide to the jurors in the case. Typically, jurors, some of you have done jury duty, I'm sure. You're expert at many things, and you're perhaps you're good at discerning the facts, but jurors always need instruction, assistance, guidance from the court about the state of the law in order to match what they've learned about the facts with the law for purposes of their deliberations. And Celia's case is no exception. On both sides, the defense team on the one hand and prosecutors on the other present to the court their proposed instructions for the jury, their proposal for how the jury should deliberate on the case of Celia. And here, and I want to acknowledge Allison Gorsuch, my colleague in the Celia Project, who did these transcriptions for us. These are beautiful manuscript documents that are just impossible to work with in a public talk. So I thank Allison for this. The defendant's proposition to the court is that the jury should be instructed, in essence, that if Celia acted to protect herself against a forced sexual intercourse, that she should be found not guilty, right? In other words, this is the instruction about self-defense that the defendants propose, and as my notes suggest, is refused by the court. And instead, here the prosecution's instructions, quite elaborate and really remarkably specific to the facts of the case, in essence, explain to the jury that the law does not permit this defendant to claim or to exercise a right of self-defense against her owner. And so here we have, again, a small, seeming almost ministerial moment in this proceeding where everything turns for Celia and for her defense team. Without the ability to claim self-defense, without the ability to argue to the jury that Celia was entitled to exercise self-defense, her fate is in essence sealed, and the jurors are left with very little choice but to in fact convict her. And what I want to suggest to you is that this is the kind of small violence that is so powerful in a case like Celia. We focus a great deal on Celia's execution, and it's an important and grave moment in this story. But I want to suggest to you through this look at the ways in which all throughout this proceeding, small considerations, seemingly ministerial choices by a judge themselves do a kind of violence, cut off, right, the story that Celia has told, that everyone has admitted to, and deprive the jury of even considering those facts as they decide her fate. So a kind of state violence in law, narrative violence, before we get to execution or hanging. I promise to come back to the character of George, because George gives us another opportunity to appreciate the kind of narrative violence that is unfolding throughout the investigation and the trial of Celia helps us appreciate the ways in which the stories she might tell are perverted, are twisted, are used in ways that undermine, I think, how she might be experiencing this proceeding. So I want to tell you a little bit about George. You'll remember that George is the other enslaved person the adult enslaved person on the Newsom farm in 1855 when Celia kills her owner. Some said that George was Celia's friend. Others said that George was Celia's lover. Some even suggested that George was the father of the third child. It was strongly suggested that part of what motivated Celia was George's admonition that she quit or resist her owner going forward, that she end the sexual encounters that had long characterized that relationship. Hard to say, but I want to look at some of the evidence with you once again to appreciate the kind of narrative violence that is being constructed in this case and how new evidence might help us think critically about it. So we have in the record lots of sworn statements from neighbors, investigators, and the like. This one, a pretrial statement from William Powell, who's a neighbor, who owns a neighboring farm. And Powell is recounting what transpired in those hours immediately after it was discovered that Celia's owner had gone missing. He interviews George, the man he refers to as Negro boy George, and he explains how he asked George where he thought Celia's owner had gone, and George's owner had gone. And he explains that what George told him was that likely their owner had last been walking along the path leading from the house to the Negro cabin, which is Celia's cabin, seemingly directing them to Celia, making the suggestion perhaps that if not she herself, something that transpired around her cabin will explain the owner's absence. And here, if you're like me, this is that moment where I think, wow, is what's happening here that George is betraying Celia, that he is revealing, at least in a somewhat only a somewhat veiled way, what has happened the night before. Then at the trial, Powell testifies again. Here he answers a question on cross-examination. He says, I went into the cookhouse where Celia was. I told her she knew where her master was, that George had said enough to make me believe she knew where he was. She denied it. And so here now we see the way in which this alleged conversation with George not only becomes evidence in and of itself, but is used, in a sense, to undercut Celia's confidence in her friend or her confidant, and also to attempt to extract or to pressure Celia to confess. George said you had something to do with it. Don't you want to tell us you had something to do with it? But the testimony has changed here, is part of what I want you to notice when we get to trial. And the last bit of trial testimony from another neighbor, Jefferson Jones. And Jones explains, this is a long passage, but what he explains is, in his questioning of Celia, how she is resolute. Now, Jones is accusing George of having had a role in their owner's death, and Celia is resolute that George had nothing to do with it, that he knew nothing about what had happened, and that she was the one who had struck her owner and killed him. So Celia telling and sticking to the same story again and again. But it is the accumulation of this sort of evidence that I think for a long time left readers with the sense that George was disloyal to Celia. In the Jones testimony, goes on to say that George had run away, that he explains to Celia that George has run away and abandoned her. And for many historians and many readers of the Celia case, this sort of sealed the deal, that somehow George had, if he'd had a role in it, he had abandoned Celia, left her holding the bag, if you will, to face the court alone. And for a long time, we accepted the idea that George had run away because these witnesses had told us that that's what they told Celia. Our group spent some time in 2014 at the Historical Society of the Kingdom of Callaway Historical Society, where not the trial records, but the estate records of Robert Newsom are kept. And here in these records, what we see is something new, something we hadn't known, and I know you can't read it here, but in the inventory of Newsom's estate, and Newsom is Celia's owner, in the inventory of the estate are 3 slaves, 2 of them Celia's children, and the third is George. And when we go further into this record, what we find is not only is George still present and accounted for in this household when the estate is accounted, but that he is eventually sold, as are Celia's children. And so here, there's a way in which again, this kind of narrative violence is done to Celia's story, one that might leave us, but perhaps more importantly, the court, with the impression that George had been complicit but disloyal to Celia, certainly might have left Celia with that impression. And it's only when we get outside of that record, when we look for other kinds of sources, that we begin to fill out this story and appreciate the way in which not only Celia faces a terrible fate in the wake of her owner's death, but so does George, and so do the children of Celia, all of them first placed on this list, given a value, and then finally sold to new owners. So I want to end by talking a little bit about our project and how we're thinking going forward about the Celia case, and move to this subject of memory. Once we appreciate not only Celia's humanity and the complexity of her story, once we pull back the layers a bit and begin to set aside some of the assumptions, perhaps the wrong assumptions that the court record gives us, what then are we left to do, if anything? Say her name suggests we're charged with acting on what we learn. And that's the last piece. Celia's story was first retold in 1991 by historian Melton McLaurin in what today is a very popular text, and I recommend it to you if you're interested in reading more about Celia. But McLaurin ushered in a period of extraordinary memory practices around Celia. 1995, Margaret Bush Wilson, an activist and attorney in St. Louis, works with artist Solomon Thurman to create this portrait of Celia that you see here. In Fulton itself, activists, community members have come together to remember Celia as a way of focusing the community on its present-day challenges around race relations. There have been stage productions, both in Fulton, in London, and recently someone won one of Yale's very prestigious drama awards for a play on Celia's story. So here the creative arts playing a role, helping us interpret the case anew by way of imagination, by way of creativity. And then there's the Celia Project. And the work that we have proposed to do includes work around coming back to the courthouse, coming back to legal culture, appreciating history, appreciating the creative arts, fiction, appreciating the community activism, and asking ourselves what role the courthouse should play. So I'll leave you with a question, and it is one about what it is that law might do in the case of Celia, might do in light of what we know today. And our suggestion is a posthumous pardon for Celia, that we might ask the courts of Missouri, the governor of Missouri, to revisit Celia's case, to appreciate the insights that come from the evidence, both old and new, and to tell us something new about the way in which law views the problem of sexual violence, power, and the state. So I look forward to a conversation with you all about that prospect, and with that I'll say thank you very much.
Now we have some time. We have some time for question and answers. We'll have 2 mics on either side here available for you to engage with Professor Jones.
So I can say, to try and entice you into a conversation about what it means to pardon Celia, I can tell you that posthumous pardons are rare, and yet we can tell a story about many that have been granted as a way of rethinking the history of slavery, the history of Jim Crow and segregation. Just recently in the state of New Hampshire freed 14 slaves in 2013. That sounds almost like an oxymoron, except the state legislature had on its desk a 1779 petition from 14 slaves who had claimed to be free people by virtue of their service in the American Revolution. And in 2013, the legislature took it up and finally granted them their freedom. Clearly a symbolic act, but a powerful one, I think, for thinking about Celia's case. So, hi.
Hi, I'm a resident of Fulton also. But I had a question about, to clarify, the initial instructions that we saw, was that like to say, basically, if he had been raping her, you must acquit? Was that way from the defense attorneys, and that was never presented to the jury? Is that what happened?
That's exactly right. And in the court file, which is a manuscript file, you can see the document that lists the proposed instructions, and the judge X's some and refuses them and accepts others. So we can see his deliberations as he goes through the proposal. And yes, that was the proposal, and it was one that he refused. I think he uses the word refuse in the margin of the document.
Okay, and as far as being a Callaway County resident and a Fulton person, that's of interest to me. So if there's a way to find out more about it, I'd be interested.
Yeah, I'd be happy to follow up with you and share that. And I should say, these records, these manuscript records, the court file for the criminal proceeding have all been digitized, and so we can look at them together and develop even additional insights from them. So I'd love to share that with you.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I have 2 questions. The first being, what do we know about her defense counsel? And the second, what do we know about defense counsel in general for enslaved people that faced capital crimes at that time?
Yeah, thank you for the question. What we know is that Celia has a team. They are chosen because they are perceived to be distinguished, expert, and experienced. So one of the remarkable things about this case is that Celia really receives what in lawyer talk we would term a zealous defense in this case. And I think those who speculate about that moment in which she's secreted out of the jail for a time to avoid execution ascribe that to the zealous lawyers and their allies. And so she gets a remarkably spirited defense, one that takes this case to the state high court when they fail at the trial level. And we can say that a couple of things about that are typical. That is to say that judges are appointing lawyers, as was true in Celia's case. They would be appointing lawyers more generally for enslaved people, especially when there isn't an owner available to provide the defense lawyer. They're going to be drawing on lawyers who they know and who are familiar in this case, the county court, right? People with reputations who are known to the court. And we can appreciate the way in which it's important, I think, for this court, for its legitimacy, right, to not to give short shrift to the question of Celia's defense, not to execute this trial by way of something like a slipshod or a summary proceeding, that the court's reputation more generally and its reputation around the regulation of slavery partly rests on its investment in a kind of genuine adversarial process in which enslaved people are defended. One of the things that distinguishes Celia's case from other capital cases, though not all of them, but from many of them, is that she doesn't have an owner who steps in to provide her defense. But if we looked more generally at capital cases, what we'd find is that it's not infrequent for owners to step in to provide counsel. Now here, they do that out of a selfish interest, which is to say the execution of a slave is the loss, perhaps, of an investment of property, if not a human being. And so it's not unusual to find enslaved people receiving zealous defenses. This is a way in the antebellum period that young lawyers and experienced lawyers new to the jurisdiction, build their reputations and their practices by representing enslaved people, by representing free African Americans. This is a strategy when one isn't sought after by distinguished whites in the community. Young lawyers build their reputations this way. So not a surprise as a general proposition, but I do think that this team is especially zealous in representing Celia, and it's partly why we have such a robust record today through which we can tell her story.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any final questions or comments for Professor Jones? Okay, well, let's thank her again, please, for a wonderful presentation. Thank you. And there's a book signing to follow, so please meet us outside. Thank you for coming.